So welcome to this ACUR at ANU student group presentation session. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past, present and future. My name is Deanna and I will be chairing today's session. Our first presenters for today are Jessica Turner and Narelle Jones. Please start when you're ready.
Okay, hey everyone. Apologies for the lack of background and our computer technical difficulties. So I'm Narelle and this is Jess. Our honours project this year is looking at captive reptile welfare assessment with a focus on land tortoises. So there are many ways in which we can measure welfare. The Zoo and Aquarium Association used the 5 domains model, in which the animal's nutrition, environment, physical health and behaviour, and how each of these domains contribute either negatively or positively to the overall well-being of an individual animal are all considered. The domain we're focusing on for our project is behaviour and how it can be used to assess welfare. So in order to improve the welfare of animals kept in captivity, we need to first ensure all of the animal's resource needs are met, and then be able to identify behaviours associated with both positive and negative welfare that can be monitored over time to get a representation of the animal's emotional well-being. In an institutional attempt to do this, the past decade has seen the development of a number of assessment tools developed to assess the welfare of a particular species or individual animal.
Reptiles, including tortoises, are increasingly being held in zoos. However, the majority of assessment tools developed so far have primarily focused on mammals, with little research existing on reptile welfare assessments. Husbandry of reptiles can be difficult as they are often described as being behaviourally inexpressive. And for the majority of species held in zoos, there are little field-based behavioural observations available to assist in determining what good welfare standards look like, particularly when we're looking at a behavioural domain. Additionally, controversy exists around the use of wild or field-based behaviours as a standard for good welfare in a captive setting due to a wide variety of contributing factors. When considering welfare assessment, we talk about resource-based or animal-based indicators. Resource-based measures relate to the animal's environment. They include indicators such as housing, food, and water. They are quantitative, objective measures that are easily repeated and recorded, making them highly practical for the use in a zoo environment. Although still common practice in zoos, resource-based assessment tools can only provide an indirect measure of welfare and do not consider the experiences of the individual animals. In short, the adequate provision of the resources does not necessarily equate to good welfare for the individual. As such, a recent shift in the trend of welfare science has seen the supplementation of resource-based assessments with animal-based indicators. Animal-based indicators directly measure a combination of physical, physiological, and behavioural variables, and also consider the varied response of the individuals to the same provision of resources. A combination of both resource and animal-based indicators is recommended to gain a more holistic view of an individual animal's welfare state. Guidelines for the management of reptiles in captivity tend to utilise resource-based indicators rather than animal-based measures of welfare, and it has been suggested that the latter are comparatively under-investigated. As a result, there is a need to develop and validate a reptile-specific welfare assessment tool that has a focus on animal-based measures.
So our project aims to develop and validate a reptile-specific welfare assessment tool and compare the outcome with that generated by a generic zoo cross-species assessment tool through observational studies of 5 tortoise collections across 2 locations with a total population of 20 individuals. It's hypothesised that the use of a reptile-specific animal-based indicators will produce an assessment tool that's more sensitive to changes in behaviour indicative of welfare of captive tortoises when compared to the use of non-reptile specific assessment tools. Land tortoises, some of which are pictured here on the screen, were the species of reptiles selected for inclusion in the study due to being the most widely available across zoos SA. The development of the proposed tortoise-specific welfare assessment tool was broken down into 3 separate trials. 17 animal-based indicators, some of which here, all of which are listed on the screen, were identified as having potential for inclusion in a tortoise-specific welfare assessment tool through expert consultancy. These indicators were collated, and a pilot study with a sample size of 4 animals, referred to from here on as trial 1, was used to develop a testable prototype. In all 3 trials, observations occurred over a 3-day period. Each day, 3 10-minute observation periods were used between 8 AM and 4 PM to assess daytime behaviours, and video camera recordings were used to assess the ability of the tool to capture these behaviours. Trial 1 was conducted by researchers only, being Jess and myself, to test the feasibility of the proposed tool. Upon completion and following reflection on the practicality of the selected criteria, a usable prototype was developed for use in subsequent trials. In the second trial, observations were made by both researchers and a keeper from each zoo to test inter-rater reliability between observers with no previous experience with the species and experienced tortoise keepers. Welfare scores were generated using 3-point Likert scales, using the developed prototype and the currently implemented generic assessment tool for comparison. In the third trial, the keeper from trial 2 and another keeper from each zoo scored observations to determine test-retest reliability, inter-rater reliability between 2 experienced observers, and the ease of use by end users in the absence of research.
Once developed, the tool will be further validated by manipulating the tortoise's environment and evaluating the tool's ability to identify any behavioural changes which may indicate a change in welfare. To do so, baseline data was recorded using the same method outlined for the tool's development. Additionally, for comparison, an ethogram was created by a scan sampling for the duration of 2 minutes every hour between 8 AM and 3 PM. An ethogram is a list of expressed behaviours and the duration of each behaviour. Behaviours included in the ethogram include resting, eating and drinking, standing, digging, and walking. An increase in behavioural diversity could indicate improved welfare state. Following the collection of the baseline data, the individual tortoise collections will either be subject to an environmental change or an enclosure upgrade. The animals were given a 10-day acclimatization period before subsequent observations were made. This is to ensure that any stress-induced behaviour of the environmental change has subsided before any additional data was collected. The secondary data will be collected through the same process as stated above. The welfare tool will be used on every enclosure before and after the environmental change. So each enclosure's baseline will act as its own control. And once again, we're also using a generic tool for comparison.
So we're still currently collecting our data, but as I said, it's expected that the use of reptile-specific indicators will produce an assessment tool that is more sensitive to changes in behaviour indicative of welfare than when compared to use a non-reptile specific tool. From our preliminary results, we can see that variation does exist in welfare scores generated by the 2 tools, and that the developed tool is sensitive enough to detect changes in behaviour following environmental changes or enclosure upgrades. However, we have not yet determined whether these changes are statistically significant.
For the ethogram, it is expected that after the enclosure upgrade, the tortoises will have the opportunity to display more varied behaviour more frequently. At this stage of the project, as Narelle mentioned, we are still collecting data. However, we can see that the behavioural diversity has increased following the enclosure upgrades, and this is reflected in the increased welfare score recorded using the developed prototype, which is very exciting results for us to see. Although, they are promising, it is important to note that our developed prototype has not yet been validated, and thus we cannot be sure that the change in welfare state has occurred. Further validation of the tool is something that will be required in future studies. So why is this project relevant and what impact will it have? Well, a validated tortoise-specific welfare assessment tool will provide a foundation for future research regarding reptilian welfare, especially in the context of reptile behaviour. If successful, this project will improve the accuracy and practicality of zoological welfare assessments, important industry considerations when improving welfare of captive reptiles. Thank you so much for your time today. We'd like to thank our supervisors, our research group, Zoos SA and Zoo Victoria, and the AVA Animal Welfare Trust.
That's done.
Thank you, Jessica and Narelle. I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen, please. Thank you. Now, there are 5 minutes for Q&A now. I will set the timer for that. Now, first of all, I'll open the floor for questions from judges. Judges, do you have any questions?
Thank you very much, girls. That was really, really interesting. Something I have to admit I've never even thought about, so that's great.
You and everyone else.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And a really good project. So congratulations, well done. Can I ask what sort of changes you would make to the environment to make an impact on the behavioural change in the tortoises?
Yeah, so one of the biggest changes that were made is actually a complete new enclosure was created for one of the collections of tortoises. So they did have two small enclosures. So one was a summer enclosure and the other one was indoors for a winter enclosure. They were both roughly the same size, about the size of a small room. And now they've converted a large aviary. So now there's a large dedicated indoor section, a semi-shaded outdoor section, and then an even bigger completely outdoor section that they'll have free access to in summer.
Great, that's really good. And just one more thing, how would zookeepers normally assess whether or not a tortoise was healthy and happy in their environment? I mean, I know you said there's a generic tool, but you know, would they look at not just disease or or injury, or for example, how would they actually assess that, or would they really not have much of an idea?
Yeah, so zoos at the moment for all of their animals use like a cross-species assessment tool. So there'll be some species like primates that have their own tool, but generally for all the zoos across the zoo, they use the same one. Right. So this tool looks at a number of different factors like husbandry, like physical health, like you said, like disease or injuries, and behaviours as well. But the categories are really quite broad. Obviously, if you're going to be using the same tool to assess a tortoise and a lion, say, for example, they're going to be quite different. So the tool's quite vague, so that it can be used across all the species. So they definitely still are valid and they're useful. We're just seeing whether or not the use of a tool with more targeted reptile-specific behaviours, being that they are quite behaviourally inexpressive and different to the other species, whether or not it's more accurate to use reptile-specific indicators.
Good, great, thank you very much. Well done.
Hi, great talk and lovely insights as well. I was just wondering about the behavior of animals in the enclosures, how much of the impact it has based on the presence of other animals around, or the presence of family members around.
In terms of like whether they're kept on their own or in groups, or
yes, either on their own as a species and no other species are present with them. So does it have a large role in the behavior of the animals? And second was around if it is just members of the same species, are they same family or different families? And does it have an impact on the behavior? And how does your tool incorporate those other measures of environment, I guess?
Sure. So obviously that's not something that we've measured directly, but in regards to kind of any species of animal, they would be kept either solitary or in a group depending on what they would be naturally. So if it's naturally a solitary animal, they're probably not likely to bring it into a zoo and mix it with all different animals. Same thing, I guess, at a lot of like the open range zoos, such as Monado, they do have some enclosures where they do try and mix species that would generally be kept to live together in the wild. The tortoises were all kept in species-specific groups, so only in small groups of the same species. I think all of them here are of unknown origin. So I think there was, one collection was bred specifically. All the others were rescues, so they've just been dumped or whatever, and they've taken them on. So whether or not they're the same family member, they're unsure. But in terms of their welfare, I guess this is why we try and measure things like behaviour. In terms of like co-occupant aggression was one of the things that we had on ours, social behaviours and interactions, things like that, to see how they do handle, I guess, living with conspecifics. I would, like I said, we didn't measure it specifically, but I would imagine their welfare would be a lot higher being kept in the groups rather than being kept solitary, because they are group.
Just to further that, all of the tortoise collections we've looked at, they have been on their own with just the one species of tortoise, with the exception of the giant Aldabra tortoise and the staccato tortoise at Adelaide Zoo that we've also incorporated in the project. They are different species, but they seem to get on together well. We haven't observed any issues with them being in the enclosure together.
I think pretty sure it's been they've been together for roughly like 10 or 15 years. They're really quite old, those tortoises, and they've been together for a long time. They did have some trouble with aggression. There was a giant Aldabra with another species a long time ago, and they did see some aggression, but they haven't noticed any that are kept together.
Lovely, thank you, Jessica and Narelle. That brings us to the end of the Q&A session and the end of Jessica and Narelle's presentation. I would now like to introduce our next presenters, Asha, Clementi and Rebecca Crisp. Please start when you're ready. Thank you.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
The PowerPoint? Fantastic. All right. Good morning, everyone. For decades now, scholars and policymakers have turned girls' participation in education into the single most effective tool for solving gender equality. Our research investigated this principle in Myanmar, specifically in the context of primary and secondary education. We uncovered a surprising paradox between high levels of female participation in education matched with low levels of women's economic and political development. We revealed that education is not a one-size-fits-all fix for gender inequality. Instead, an ineffective education system can perpetuate existing inequality and reinforce traditional gender roles.
In 2019, Asha and I received Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade New Colombo Plan funding to complete primary research in country into an aspect of Myanmar's social or political economy. Myanmar is 109th in the world when ranked according to measurements of gender equality. As students with a keen interest in international development and more specifically into gender equality, Asha and I knew immediately that this would be our focus.
In the months prior to departing for Myanmar, we began our secondary research. We assessed historical documents, data, and secondary reports to improve our understanding of Myanmar's complex pedagogic history, from pre-colonial monastic education to colonial mandates, military, post-military, and democratic transitions.
We then pulled together the limited publicly accessible data on participation statistics across primary and secondary education, disaggregated by gender. Along with secondary reports, we aim to piece together a picture of the relationship between the evolutions of educational policy, their effects on girls' participation at school, and then to their broader contribution to gender equality as a whole.
But a true and complete picture of gender equality in Myanmar remained elusive. Official statistics were rare and incomplete. Specifically, we had limited information about the number of girls actually in school. Secondary reports revealed contradictory insights into female participation in education. Some criticized exclusionary educational practices, while others argued that the myth of the disempowered Burmese women misrepresented the reality of a highly educated female population.
To test our theories and gain new data, we conducted interviews and visited schools in the town of Inle Lake in Myanmar's Western Shan state. We sat down with parents and teachers at their homes and in schools. We interviewed panels of academics and visited NGOs. These interviews allowed us to ask targeted questions, investigating the barriers to access, participation, and achievement in schools and beyond.
We found two major factors perpetuating gender inequality, despite, in theory, an education system which promoted equal access to both genders. Firstly, the poor quality of the education system actively disempowers female students. Secondly, societal attitudes towards education and gender perpetuate traditional social roles.
Traditional attitudes toward gender roles are promoted as soon as children start school. The curriculum itself is implicitly gendered. For example, an English workbook for kindergarten students depicted female illustrations alongside verbs like cook and clean. Farming and sport were depicted with images of men. Interviewees reported that this gender stereotyping was commonplace in the curriculum across age groups. Furthermore, interviews with staff members at school revealed a focus on encouraging girls to pursue traditionally female-dominant industries, such as teaching. Promotion of these ideas throughout the education system leads to the social conditioning of women that pushes them to pursue low-income careers.
Secondly, the content learned in education does not contribute to the development of workplace relevant skills. All respondents reported that even at a tertiary level, the skills gained in education were rarely used in the workforce. Only 2 respondents worked in the occupation they studied at university, both teachers. For most low to middle income families, occupations such as farming yielded the greatest returns. One parent stated she had a degree in history from a local university, but returned to farming for a higher income. Paradoxically, in Myanmar, jobs which require higher education attract little prestige and are poorly paid. These trends stem from a historical legacy wherein professions such as law and finance were part of largely irrelevant institutions. With the rule of law controlled by an authoritarian power and corruption rife in finance and administration, these roles were somewhat redundant. This has created professional divides which still remain today. Careers which do not require university education, including politics and farming, attract higher pay and are typically male-dominated. Women are staying in school longer, often gaining a tertiary education. However, this causes them to end up in professions such as law and teaching, which require university degrees but are paid less.
This phenomenon has a dual impact. Firstly, it means that the long-held belief that education necessarily results in long-term economic empowerment in this context is false. More insidiously, it means that the longer girls remain stuck in school, the less they are earning compared to their male counterparts. A high proportion of boys, typically in rural areas, drop out at the end of primary school to enter the workforce, often in a trade or in their family's farm. This creates an impossible to close economic gap between the genders before they even reach adulthood.
Education as a tool for empowerment only works if that education is informed, effective, and respected. For Myanmar, traditional policy approaches focusing on achieving gender equity through girls' access to education are simply not working. Burmese women spend years in school, but this limits their long-term empowerment rather than supporting it.
However, there are some positives. High participation in education can be a platform to encourage gender-based, balanced social attitudes in younger generations. This social shift is already starting through after-school youth groups and new women's organisations. These organisations, which allow communities to share concerns and experiences, should be encouraged through increased government support and consultation processes.
A push for change must come from both national and local levels, meeting in the middle to drive progress. At a grassroots level, the communication of new ideas must come from the teachers who are currently perpetuating old sexist stereotypes. This could occur through diversity and inclusion awareness training for teachers, designed specifically to help them identify and counteract bias. Nationally, the government should push to raise the status of traditionally female careers, especially teaching. Doing so requires economic investment and increased resources, but this will empower Myanmar's teachers and in turn its students. Increasing teachers' salaries could boost the status of women in Myanmar and even encourage increased male participation in teaching, working to break down gender barriers one teacher at a time. Finally, the government must work to increase the teaching of applicable skills in higher education, supporting the prestige and financial value of tertiary qualifications. This can be done through financial support for vocational and skills-based degrees, apprenticeships, and training.
In summary, Myanmar's complex history presents a challenge to the accepted norms of development and gender equality. High inequality persists despite high levels of educational participation for women. Solving this paradox requires solutions appropriate to a unique socio-cultural context. To ensure education is a tool for empowering women, the quality of this education must be drastically reformed. These reforms must be supported by diversity and inclusion training for teachers, salary increases in careers which require tertiary education, and increased access to vocational training. Now, it's important to acknowledge that our primary research, like any, has its limitations. Conducting interviews in Myanmar, while an incredible opportunity, came with language barriers, a lack of historical data, limited scope, and especially now, the difficulty of repeatability. While we worked to ensure these barriers limited our research as little as possible through the use of translators, repetition of questions across respondents, seeking clarification when necessary, using expert advice, these issues posed a definite challenge to our research.
Reflecting on this research, we have gained a few important insights, some of which go well beyond the scope of this project specifically. First, this research reiterates the importance of cultural nuance and localized research. As passionate and well-informed students, Becca and I were familiar with the widespread policy of using education as a key tool to advance gender equality. We therefore began our project with the implicit intention of making a cogent case for increasing girls' access to schooling as what we believe to be the surest way to improve Myanmar's dismal progress towards gender equality. However, this kind of broad brush approach to policy making is blind to cultural and historical differences and the unintended consequences which can ensue.
Secondly, and related, is that our research illustrates the fundamental importance of in-country experiences. Particularly in a region where consistent data and previous research is often lacking, there is no replacement for the conversations had and the evidence obtained in country. Finally, these in-country experiences are irreplaceable for developing the capability and expertise of undergraduate students. Through this project, we refined our communication skills, interacting with people and communities from diverse backgrounds, and developed the ability to think critically and creatively about our data and research. The experience was formative for us both personally and as future academics, and should be part of every undergraduate student's university experience. Thank you so much for listening. And we'd also like to acknowledge Andre's wonderful photos that we took on this trip that illustrated our presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca and Asha. I might ask you to stop sharing your screen as well. Thank you. Now we have 5 minutes for question time. I'll set the timer. Judges, do you have any questions?
I'll begin. You kept mentioning about equality, and could you just highlight the difference between equality and equity when it comes to female participation in these higher roles? And what are the what are the policies that ensure equality, and what are the policies that ensure equity?
Yeah.
Did you find any difference in Myanmar?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really great question. And that hinges on one of the biggest issues that we found. So we use the UNDP kind of metrics for measuring inequalities. So things like labour force participation rates, employment, statistics of educational attainment. So that formalised theoretical metric is the one that we used. However, I think there are two parts to your question. The second part was into the difference between equity and equality. And that was really evident in our research because there is equitable participation in education. So there are the same number of male and female participants in education. And in some cases, women outnumber men, particularly at the higher levels of education. However, that is not equality, because equality, well, depending on your philosophical approach to equality, which remains somewhat contentious in the literature, so I won't try and get into that conversation, but generally seen, equality looks to outcomes, so to things like long-term employment outcomes, welfare, standard of living, and input into political decision making is a key one. And on those metrics, the achievement that Myanmar has attained in achieving equity in education has not translated into those more substantive forms of equality, and I think that's a really important distinction. So I'm glad you raised it.
And also, like, I was just wondering about the influence of technologies such as internet technologies, and does it have any recent impact coming out of the historical norms and then adopting what the world is doing as well? So did you see any changes or differences because of the internet technologies?
I'll pass this one to Asha, but just briefly to address your question, because I think this is a really interesting point. The schools that we visited had a marked lack of digital education mechanisms. So we mentioned that we were looking to the kind of kindergarten picture books, and those, I know, in many Western, so to speak, contexts now are replaced by iPads. But we were looking into rural schools that had almost no access to technology. So I would say that it wasn't a beneficial input. It wasn't necessarily detracting from the equality, but it just didn't exist yet. Asha, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what it came down to wasn't necessarily the sort of like physical tool, so the picture book compared to the iPad, but it was the lack of connection and awareness of sort of the reforms that had happened in other parts of the world. So not being exposed to those other ideas. And that was the thing that was the most handicapping of the lack of technology. So yeah, the lack of internet really did make a difference. And it's fascinating to see the way that people in Myanmar interact with internet because they had it barred from them from so many years under the previous military dictatorship that they don't have any of that sort of prior understanding of how much it could contribute or any of that infrastructure built in.
And just last question, like this criteria of interrogating equality and equity, I guess were defined by international standards. So did you consult with the locals about the criteria that are suitable to them in terms of like what they consider as equality and equity? Or what are their aspirations, I guess, in terms of their growth?
I think Asha and I can fight over answering this one because you raise a really interesting point. I think one thing that we found exactly as you kind of implied there is that you can't use you can't just take international factors and put them into what is such a culturally nuanced community. That said, we tried to kind of stay loyal to more robust and kind of non-negotiable forms. So things like reducing gender-based violence, increasing female access to kind of labour force participation and political decision-making are relatively unshakable. And we did consult and we found that that's kind of generally accepted. And what we didn't try and push into was more of those kind of culturally contingent factors. So things like the age that women get married and things like that become a bit more culturally nuanced. And I think we would have to be A, trained in anthropology, and B, live in country for a lot longer to fully understand those factors. And we were well aware of that. Fortunately, we had some incredible guides and translators, and we were able to get, I think, a really good insight into those kinds of cultural nuances because we were in country and making a concerted effort to leave our biases at the door, which was a learning process in itself.
Thank you. Sorry, the question time is actually just finished, but since this is a smaller session, if Dr. Lee Wilson, you have a quick question, I'll invite you to ask that.
Oh, no, I just want to say thank you. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I just wondered, you said some of the women actually had degrees. Were there many of them that commented that women left the country afterwards to go elsewhere? Or did they tend to remain in country once they'd done their education?
They primarily remained in country. There was sort of a broader want to travel, but again, we were doing our research in sort of more rural areas. So their finances and resources were often limited. And their primary focus was more sort of getting the degree and then finding the pathway that would make them the most money and give them the highest financial reward. And because that was often turning back to something like farming, the idea of moving overseas wasn't particularly at the forefront of their mind.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you, presenters and judges. That brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you to our judges, Dr. Lee Wilson and Hardeep Patel, and congratulations to our student presenters. This recording will be made available online following the conference, and we hope to see you in our other conference sessions today. I will stay behind if anyone has any questions, but presenters, you are free to go when you wish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Congratulations.
Thanks so much, Diana.
Thank you.
Well done.